table, so I welcome everyone here at Bolivar House. Before I make the introduction of our speaker today, I do want to remind you of the ancestral land where we are. We're in the land of the territory of the Ohlone original peoples. They're often referred to as the Costanoan, which is really a misnomer, since this really derives just from saying Costa Nueva by the Spanish, which is the name they gave to the inhabitants of this area of California. The Ohlone spoke various languages with the Yokutian family, which is not really very well understood. And they extended from San Francisco throughout the peninsula towards the south. The specific language, the term that is often used is Ramaitush, but this was a term kind of figured out by linguists in the 1970s for the specific language spoken in this area where we are. Where we do have the Baby Walk towards Sausalito, towards the north, the Tochenio on the East Bay, the Aguaguas in the Santa Cruz area, and the Tamien in the area of Santa Cruz. So I just want to remind us about these kinds of things before we start, and I'm going to try to make this reminder in many of our events. So today we have the pleasure of having Brigitte Algee-Hewitt with us. She is the senior research scientist at the Center for Comparative the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity, CCSRE, here at Stanford. She has been a visiting professor in various universities, institutions, in the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, in Florida State University, in the University of Tennessee. She has a very unique background. She actually had her BA is in classical philology and art history. Then she studied an MA in Asian Bronze Age archaeology in Bryn Mawr, and then she did a PhD in biological anthropology. So her research, as you will see today, is quite unique. She looks into trying to understand skeletal and genetic trait variation in the past and in the present populations. She uses big data analysis, hands-on laboratory approaches to estimate personal identity parameters like sex, ancestry, stature, age in the biological profile. In order to do these kinds of things, and this is where I'm going to finish, I told you a little bit about the indigenous languages. So Brigitte, I mean, the CV is really long, a lot of incredible publications, but she speaks English, French, German. She also can read and write Italian, Greek, Spanish, Danish. She can translate French, Latin, ancient Greek, and she's perfectly conversant with R, OpenBox, MATLAB, SAS, SPSS, JMP, NCSS, Tableau, C++, Python, VBA, Java. The list keeps on going on and on. So, Brigitte, thank you.
Well, I should say I can cheat on that list because language and bone identification and computer programming, it's all pattern analysis. So it just transfers one to the other. So it's not nearly as impressive as that vertical makes it out. So thank you for coming today. I'm delighted to be a speaker here in class. I'm a long admirer of the work that you do here. So I'm very glad to be able to tell you a little bit about my research. So today I'm going to talk about the crisis of forced migrants and the problems of the identification of the dead along the U.S. México border. And I will start, however, by giving you a little background into what that actually means and what I actually do from a laboratory perspective. And then I won't put you through the computational stuff, although I will give some computational results and a little discussion as we move further in. So as a biological anthropologist, I had the advantage of being at the University of Tennessee, which is sort of the founding center for forensic anthropology, and it has a research center where we study how remains decompose under different conditions. So it allows us to have a training in both the fundamentals of skeletal biology and human variation, but also to have the contemporary application abilities so that we can work with law enforcement and in the medical, legal, and humanitarian context to make identifications for anyone that a medical examiner cannot identify visually. So it involves, that kind of work involves the recovery and the analysis of skeletal or often badly decomposed, can be compromised in terms of fragmentary or burned remains of anyone of unknown or questionable identity, with the goal of taking the unknown skeleton and linking it up with that known person. Okay, so ultimately our mission is to return those remains back to the family so that their loved ones can have closure. So it's the forensic anthropology then is a subset of biological anthropology, which used to be called physical anthropology. And it's the application to the legal process. I'll push back a little bit against that because most of my work now is human rights focused or in the humanitarian context, but the fundamentals are the same. So as Alberto mentioned, that we look to identify those parameters of identity. It's essentially anything that you would describe yourself using in life, or what you might find on your driver's license, and what ultimately would end up on a missing persons list if a family or friend was coming to describe you to a forensic professional or a missing person victim's right advocate. So we would estimate sex, ancestry, age, stature, and then we also look for those signatures in the remains or in your bones that might tell us something about what happened to you, what context that happened in, and how long ago. So essentially, we provide all of this assistive identification, so the information that gets us whittling down that missing persons list, which gives law enforcement or the human rights organizations the impetus and the legitimization to be able to go and request a DNA sample from a particular family. You can imagine the difficulty of going and asking for a DNA sample. So it's important that we have a pretty good, like 99.9% assurance that the person that we're asking the DNA sample to compare against is actually related to the individual that we have. So we do all of this workup then to ultimately create a positive match by DNA analysis. And so I was very lucky. I came to Stanford after doing a couple years in a forensic genetic wet lab to be able to understand and actually do that process. So now I have the ability to take it from here all the way to there and to know the pitfalls and the windfalls of those types of analyses. So I will encourage you to be holistic thinkers and to stretch your boundaries in what defines your field. Okay, so then the recovery, that laboratory analysis, and then that identification for the ultimate return of the remains is important in humanitarian contexts. And I would argue that the most pressing area of need for forensic anthropology right now is globally the migrant crisis, and in the US, it's the U.S. México Border crisis. And regretfully, there's lots of discourse around the border, but it is not the discourse around the real humanitarian crisis that's ongoing. So today then, I'm going to talk about how I take those tools as a forensic anthropologist and translate them from traditional casework settings, which would be your law enforcement consults work, to how we can mobilize that to make identification of the border dead. Okay, so violence, unrest, poverty, persecution have forced thousands of Latin American migrants, as you all are aware, from their home countries to make the journey al Norte. And they are passing through deserts, jungles, and urban spaces. And unfortunately, a large proportion of attempted border crossers end up perishing on account of dehydration, exhaustion, and injury along the journey. And it always seems to be the way that they, make this very long, treacherous journey that gets so close to the border, and then the complications of crossing the border, the complications of being disassociated from the traffickers who they pay to assist them to get across the border, the complications of the Border Patrol, who are, which are now a group of people that used to be people who they would go and present themselves to for asylum. Now they're a group of people who they fear, understandably. And then just the nature of the borderland. For people who have not been to the border is not, we think of it conceptually, right, as a demarcation line. The border is a huge, vast space of desert and no water and treacherous terrain. So there is a large proportion of migrants who make it all the way and then ultimately perish on the border, in the borderlands. And because the borderlands are that liminal space, the remains sort of fall into a questionable area for identification. That's why I say here that we have a conservative estimate, and the majority of my work is in Pima County in Arizona, because that's the area where there's the largest number of migrant death cases across all of the southern border. So we would say, just based on the numbers of cases that we've done, that about 3,100 migrants have perished in the last, since 2000. That, of course, is like a micro representation of the true number of deaths. Countless more are missing, so we have the long list of family members who have reported missing, family to the Pima County Office of the Medical Examiner, in hopes that there may be someone on that list of remains that might make a match with their missing persons report. But for the most part, the remains are just never recovered. That's because of where the people have tried to cross on the border. There's a lot of privately owned ranch land. And if you're familiar with how ranching works, there's a lot of land, and they go and walk the fences for that land over, say, like 2 or 3 year period. So there are long stretches of time in which there's been no human contact with that part of their property. So you can have someone who has crossed and perished, and the remains are there for an extended period of time, exposed to environment, animal activity, etc. And then, as I'll show later, because of the nature of the borderlands and there being a very treacherous terrain, there are lots of areas in which it's just hard to access, that desperate people will still try to cross at. And that means that they are not frequented by humanitarian groups that go searching for remains. So these numbers, please know, are very, very conservative. So in addition to knowing that we have way more deaths than what we're actually have numbers for, and in a period in which border crossers are historically very low, migrants are perishing at an increasingly high or fast rate. At the same time, my ability as a forensic anthropologist to positively identify these dead is dropping at an alarming rate. So we have numbers going up, and my ability to mitigate those numbers is being reduced. But my casework protocols and my colleagues' protocols are remaining the same. So this is pretty perplexing. So back in 2003, when I had just started doing this kind of work, 75% of our cases were positively identified. 2013, 45%. And you can imagine then, when you have so many more deaths that are compounding and your identifications are dropping, what happens? Well, people don't get returned to their families, but they also don't have anywhere to be retained in perpetuity. So we're now falling into a cycle in which remains are collected, remains are unidentified, remains are essentially destroyed, eliminating any hope of them ever being able to return to their families. So there's many levels of crises and traumas that are infecting the border region. So how can we improve identification success? So we need something to happen really quickly. It's critical that we speak to the story of the dead, that we give closure to those families and friends of the missing, and uphold our values for social justice and commitment to human rights. I would have been a statistician if I didn't care a lot about people. So this is ultimately why I do the science. This should be the driving force for a forensic anthropologist for why you are in the university doing this kind of research. So hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about some of those tensions between being an academic and being an advocate and a researcher and a practitioner. Sometimes those two don't always complement each other in the larger academy as well as we would like. I would argue that we can no longer hang on to our traditional methods. environments are changing, the populations who are crossing the border are changing, our technologies are changing. We need to completely overhaul, and if that statistic about the 45% success rate is not reason enough, then we have all these other factors that should suggest to us that we need to rethink the field completely and do a much better job at making the identifications. And I think I said in the beginning, I am a holistic thinker, and I think we need to return to the fundamentals of anthropology as a four-field discipline where we embrace what we know about archaeology, what we know about human variation, what we know about language variation. That's huge in making migrant identifications because the linguistic groups correspond to ethnic groups. So it tells us something about range of variation and population locations. But from a very practical perspective, if we don't know who is attempting to cross the border, we don't know where to send out information about missing persons. We don't know what language to send it in. We don't know who to reach. So there's all these larger anthropological questions that can feed into border work as well. So migrants don't just disappear, they are disappeared. There are a bunch of structural vulnerabilities, structural violences, and then a whole bunch of institutional pressures that contribute together to create the crisis that's ongoing at the border. So there are scientific and social factors that impede my ability to make a successful identification. And today I'm going to talk about 6 core challenges to identification, and then I'll dive into 2 case studies that will allow us to sort of think about what those challenges are in more detail, and then actually hopefully walk you through some potential solutions that embrace that more holistic perspective. So the first challenge is analytical. As I mentioned already, we are at a point in which technology is changing so rapidly. Our computational abilities are, things that we never dreamed about we can do in minutes that used to take to be coded and run hours, days. So we have so many more opportunities for improving our models, for estimating parameters. Parameters are just that sex, age, stature, those things we want to have an answer for. We have a whole variety of data types now that we can embrace. So we have phenotypic data, we have genetic data, we have skeletal data, that all of those brought together helps us flesh out the picture of those unknown remains. So it's too self-limiting to just think of the forensic anthropologist as a skeletal biologist anymore. It's important that we also understand the whole human. And be able to embrace all those different data types to help us address the identification of that whole human. And then I'm going to argue in my case study that the concepts that we're actually trying to estimate now are horribly outdated. And I'll use the example of ancestry, that the idea of ancestry is misappropriated and it's misused, and we've essentially just replaced race with ancestry. So what is done traditionally to estimate is some sort of population that's generally defined socially, as opposed to actually estimating something that's biologically relevant. The second challenge is demographic. There are changing trends in who is crossing and dying on the border. And those changes are occurring over time, and they're occurring over space. So people crossing in Arizona and people crossing in Texas are coming from different locations. And if they crossed and died 5 years ago, or they crossed and died 5 weeks ago, we may still get their remains now, but those demographics are very different. And how we go about searching missing persons lists and doing DNA matches and choosing reference samples for our models are all affected by how we understand the dynamics of the border cohort. There are structural issues, and there are of 2 sorts. So the structural issues that prevent the identification of the remains from a sociocultural perspective are the structural vulnerabilities that impede reporting. So I would argue that our biggest impediment to making an identification is the fact that we do not get family reference samples. And we do not get family reference samples because we have oppressive systems, we have marginalization, we have fear, we have racism. The groups that are so desperate to migrate are the same groups that are going to be expected to give up their DNA to go to some governmental agency and provide information about themselves. That would be terrifying, right? So you can imagine how we need to do a much better job of creating safe spaces where we can make those who are living feel comfortable and safe to be able to report their dead. I was talking to someone who had a missing family member, and she said to me, you know, I can tell you, as in like someone within my field, about my dead child at the risk of my living, or I can not tell you about my dead child and protect my living. And what would you have me do? So I think that there are many ethical questions that we'll come to, as well as structural questions that we need to think long and hard about. And then there are also structural impediments that are just the practical aspects of doing casework. The conditions of the remains, bones in the desert, it's not a forgiving environment. So extracting DNA is very difficult. Recovery locations, as I already said, are spread all across the border in remote and inaccessible areas. We have intellectual biases about what actually defines a good analysis and good data. We tend to think now that genetics is the only answer, and often genetics in compromised cases does not give us any information that's useful. And dollars to donuts, my cases are not going to be in a criminal database. Those people who are migrating are families, they're people fleeing persecution, poverty, hunger. They are not criminals attempting to get into the US. So the database searches that use forensic methods and use forensic data for those traditional profile matching is completely useless. It's a waste of energy and it's a waste of money. And then, of course, there's the issue of funding and personnel. And regrettably, there are very few places that are willing to hire someone to donate or dedicate their time as an academic to the border crisis. And there is generally, while there's lots of talk about the border, there is very little dedication to the humanitarian issues along the border. And I mean, we just need to turn on the news and we can see that we don't have issues with what we do with the living, so why would we have issues with what we do with the dead? The fourth issue then that goes nicely into that is the political impediments, the effects of policies on death rates. And I actually have one of my students here, Lily. She's been trudging through data on governmental policies, administrative changes, and looking at the correlations between those and apprehension rates and death rates. And she's done a brilliant job of being able to track how, as policies are shifting that compromise immigration, death rates go up. Apprehension rates are not really associated with the change in death rates. So there's a lot of very complex relationships between what we're doing in terms of administrative policies and how that's actually affecting those who are dying along the border. And then, you know, there's always, I get asked in media articles, can you comment on the wall? And there's just a very simple answer to that. The more barriers that are built, the bigger the wall, the more people will die. And it will do nothing to prevent the humanitarian crisis on the border. Then that brings us to the ethical impediments. As a forensic anthropologist, again, the anthropologist, I am constantly interrogating what my role is as as both the scientist and the advocate for the dead and for the families. I have to consider what the wants of the living are, what the needs of the dead are, and how we reconcile the tensions between those two. I have professional expectations that I make an identification, but is making an identification always the best thing for the family? I will say that for the most part, as I'm sure you can imagine, a family member would do anything to be able to receive the remains of their loved one. So there is no question there. It's whether or not putting whole families at risk for that to happen is the most ethical choice. So a question of professional and humanitarian ethics are huge and completely unaddressed. And then there are institutional issues. There's a big disconnect between those of us who are academics and also advocates or practitioners. Being a practitioner was always the focus of forensic research, and for that reason, you are often relegated to as a technician, as opposed to recognizing that you have an academic component to your work, and that academic component is what feeds and drives and enables that practitioner side. So there's an important recognition that needs to happen in the field between the ways that theory and practice actually complement each other, and that praxis is huge. You would not believe how many forensic anthropologists have not read Paul Freire. So I send them all my little PDFs of the theory of the oppressed. Okay, so my case study, which I will go very quickly on. Traditional approaches, as I said, to ancestry have been from looking at the cranium. It's essentially comparison by, we have these predefined populations, we have an unknown, and we use a mathematical algorithm to take the unknown and to squish it into one of those predefined populations. I can put a watermelon and a soccer ball into that algorithm, and it will say that it matches one of those populations. That should tell me right there that we have statistical and broader human variation conceptual problems. So I would argue that hard classifications into a single ancestry are completely useless. What we need to think about is admixture. And we know from an evolutionary perspective and from a recent population history perspective that, especially in the Americas, we are all admixed. We have continental representation of ancestors in different degrees, and those different degrees is what's the interesting part. But there is always, especially in our global universe now, interaction, gene exchange, that results in admixture signatures in your DNA and in your skeleton. Let's see, is that, oh, that didn't work. Okay. Well, so this is going to show you how there's a lot of variation in worldwide populations, and it was a cute little video. But I'll skip that, and I will just say that our single ancestry categories, as I'm sure all of you, based on what you study, would be very aware of the problems. They reify ideas of bounded populations. They use antiquated terminology. And of course, my biggest pet peeve is the use of Hispanic. What does that mean in a forensic setting? It presumes that all people of Latin American origin are identical. So even when they do DNA analysis in like the standards in the big forensic cases, they all just get lumped together as like they, as in the Hispanics, so that you have someone from Puerto Rico, you have someone from Guatemala, you have someone from Mexico, and they're all considered Hispanic, and they're all treated in the same statistical and biological way. And we know that population histories are hugely different, and that means that their admixture signatures are going to be hugely different. And this is just a sample of cases from the Pima County border, and you can see the range of variation just looking at the skulls in these cases. So we need to not think about everyone who is crossing the border. We need to not think about populations in general as homogeneous. And that seems like that should be obvious to us, but in terms of actual practical application, that is the underlying assumption. Okay, so I would argue then that we need to think about this admixture approach where we look at the proportions of contributions of continental ancestry. So we're still talking about ancestry, but we're not talking about one single soul ancestry. We're talking about this mosaic of ancestry. And interestingly, when you actually calculate it and you look at it regionally, there are patterns that hold by geography. So that you have signatures that we can calculate for that mosaic, and those signatures vary based on the geographic origins of the people. And that is because, for the most part, there hasn't been historically a whole lot of shifts in where people are growing up and where they're living their life, and then their children are living their lives. So there's a genetic inheritance that's sustained over recent time. So, I should back up and say, what's interesting then is that individuals of high European ancestry, so one of their proportions in the European one is very high, they have a large quantity of that, tend to be in the north. Those with high indigenous ancestry in the south, that makes sense, the Mesoamerican divide. But that allows us then to get at a biogeographic profile for someone. So instead of just saying someone's Hispanic, I can look at their signature and I can say, well, they have a high indigenous ancestry component. I think we need to look at missing persons cases that are starting in the south of Mexico and extending down into Central America. And that may seem very rudimentary, but at the present time, case reports just get sent to the Mexican consulate. And you can imagine then that they get sent there and they stagnate there. So it's baby steps towards making change. What's also really interesting is that when we map these cases, that we see patterns in the ancestry based on where people are crossing along the border. So people who have high indigenous ancestry tend to cluster together on certain areas of the border. That's where their remains have been found, versus someone with high European ancestry. And we find that this, when we do the statistical analysis, this clustering is non-random. So it means that it's being driven by the data. And we have reverse patterns, or hotspots, of where we have people with really high European ancestry, and then it switches for people with high indigenous ancestry. And then when we apply more complex models,
What do you mean by high? High is 10%, high is 50%?
no, okay, so I should say that the range of error in ancestry estimation is somewhere around 10 to 20%. So high would be like you would have 80%, 70% above there. So once you're in sort of the middle grounds, then it's much more nuanced, and that's when we start looking at more specific population signatures. So in generalities, I'd be talking above 70. Okay, oh, sorry, I should say that we can actually create models then that use this to help us estimate the origin of the person based on their ancestry signature. And when we look at those very nuanced ancestry signatures, so more information than just that high-low question, and I put it into a machine learning model, I can get an R-square of 0.75. And that means that the model is doing very well. I won't go into the statistics of it, but for a biological model, that's pretty darn good. And I'm able, with really high accuracy, like 90% accuracy, estimate the place of origin down to the state, if I'm doing Mexico, where that person originated. So that's pretty amazing, only by having the information of their quantities of indigenous ancestry and European ancestry, and the GPS coordinates of where they were recovered along the border. Okay, so then I would argue that migrants are frequently unidentified because their place of origin is unknown, so that's like a huge problem. And many more remains are never found because we don't know where those hotspots are. So hopefully I've shown by thinking broadly anthropologically about this, we can learn something about the dead by studying the habits of the living. So if we flip what I just talked about on its head, we know that the living, by talking to successful migrants, tend to follow particular pathways. That everyone from this particular city has this inherited knowledge of how to reach the border. That inherited knowledge is what drives where people are also crossing and dying on the border. So if we understand the pathways in the living, it helps us to better predict those hotspots among the deceased as well. And then in that case, we can mobilize workers to go search in those hotspots because now we have an idea of where they are. And it also allows us to do more proactive things along those migration routes, like water stations, like having support systems that help people be educated in the dangerous areas of those routes if we know that they're being used more frequently. Okay, and then one last thing, I will say that ancestry is also structured by time. And this is really interesting, that as time increases, so does indigenous ancestry in our caseload. And that's a problem because that's only happened in the last 5 years. And that means we have no standards for identification established for all of the ethnic groups from southern Mexico and Central America that are now making up the majority of our cases that need to be identified. So this has resulted in what I would call an identification bias. And I think that identification bias, and we also see it in skeletal data, but I should say we don't see it in fingerprint data or photo or visual data, which makes sense, right? Because they have driver's licenses that they're matching that to. So it's when you're actually looking at the biology and you need some standard to compare that biology to. So this identification bias in DNA or in the skeletal work is 100% in my mind driving what we're seeing in the drop in identification rates. That those rates are dropping in the same proportion as we're getting information about migrants from the more southerly parts of Mexico and Central America being the predominant migrant groups and those who are predominantly dying. So we're not changing our standards to meet the shifts in the demography. Okay, so then I would say to understand why that bias is going on, or to understand the demographic shifts better, we need to have an appreciation for the structural vulnerabilities that are forcing those people to migrate. So if we have an understanding of what's pushing people towards the border, then we can better predict who is going to be migrating in 5 years from now, so that we can be on top of things and have standards in place. So Lily is also working on this with another one of my students, and they're going through each one of my cases and looking for the date and the location. So these have been identified. The date that they were recovered and where we know that their home country and home city is, and going through newspaper reports to try to figure out, are there any correlations, factors that we can see at times and place that are causing people to migrate, with ultimately being able to build a larger model that would allow us to have these to make these predictions more effectively. And then we have to also be much more sensitive to the families, because without understanding the structural vulnerabilities that are affecting the families, we won't understand why they're not reporting their missing loved ones and how we can be better at communicating and recruiting and making people feel safe enough to approach a forensic anthropologist. So wouldn't it be wonderful if we could have a safe space at Stanford that has all the resources to be able to support this type of reporting? And then I would say, finally, marginalization begets marginalization. Paul Farmer has said that so many times. And it's very true here. If family members from migrant communities are not reached because they're already marginalized, then the dead are marginalized the same way as they were in life, and the cycle for unidentification will continue. So we have to do a better job as anthropologists, as sociologists, as human rights workers, to be able to be out working with the boots on the ground people to develop a system that allows us to have that pipeline of safe identification. Okay, and then I will stop there. Other than, this is one of Lily's plots, where you can see that as soon as administration changed, we have a huge dip in the rates of, and a huge dip which represents a huge increase in the number of deaths on the border. So that big valley right there starts in the current administration and is, and the uptake now is only a result of some of we don't have all the data in for 2019, so it's a little statistical artifact. So I suspect that that is just going to continue its plateau in that reduced space. So that shows how even on this side of the border, factors are also imposing those structural issues on the migrants. Okay, so I will stop there, and thank you. I apologize for